The kingdom of Westmere did not collapse the night Duke Caedric Ashbourne killed a man at his own banquet table. It had been collapsing for years, quietly, the way a castle erodes from the inside long before the first stone falls. But that particular evening, when the blood reached the hem of a woman's silver dress, and the aristocracy finally understood what lived behind those cold gray eyes, Westmere learned something it would never unlearn. Some men do not govern for legacy. Some men govern because the alternative is confronting what they became when no one was watching. And the Duke of Blackthorne had stopped watching himself a very long time ago. What happens next will test every assumption you carry about power, obsession, and the price of survival. What? The messenger arrived at Blackthorne Keep 3 hours before dawn, half frozen and bleeding from a gash above his left eye where a branch had caught him during the ride through the northern pass. The guards dragged him through the outer courtyard without ceremony, his boots scraping across flagstones still glazed with yesterday's ice. They did not ask his name. They did not offer water. They shoved him into the lower corridor outside the council chamber and told him to kneel. He knelt for 47 minutes before the door opened. Chancellor Aldrich Voss stepped into the corridor with the careful posture of a man who had survived 3 decades in a predator's shadow by never once raising his voice above the volume the predator preferred. His gray hair was immaculate. His hands were clasped behind his back. His eyes cataloged the messenger's injuries with the detached efficiency of a surgeon evaluating whether a patient was worth saving. "You rode through the night," Voss said. It was not a question. "The Southern Lords refused the terms." The messenger's voice cracked from cold and exhaustion. Lord Haldane tore the treaty in front of the entire assembly. He said House Ashbourne could collect its debts from the graves it keeps filling. Voss said nothing for several seconds. Then he exhaled through his nose, a sound so controlled it barely disturbed the air. "Wait here." The Chancellor disappeared back through the door. The messenger remained on his knees, shivering, listening to the wind howl through the stone corridors like something alive and furious. He had been inside Blackthorne Keep once before, as a boy, when his father delivered grain tallies to the previous duke. He remembered sunlight in the great hall, tapestries depicting hunts and harvests, laughter echoing from somewhere deep inside the castle. None of that existed anymore. Blackthorne Keep under Caedric Ashbourne was a fortress stripped to its function. The tapestries had been replaced with territorial maps marked in red and black ink. The great hall chandeliers burned at half flame, casting long shadows that made the room feel like the inside of a cathedral built for a god no one wanted to name. Every surface was clean, every corridor was silent. Every servant moved with the precise, terrified economy of people who understood that inefficiency was a form of disrespect, and disrespect inside these walls carried consequences that did not require explanation. The Duke himself appeared 20 minutes later. Caedric Ashbourne was not what the Southern propaganda described. He was not grotesque. He was not monstrous in any physical sense. He stood just over 6 feet with the lean, hard-boned frame of a man who had spent his youth in military campaigns rather than banquet halls. His dark hair was cut short. His jaw was angular, severe, built for silence more than speech. His gray eyes held the flat, mineral quality of river stones, the kind of eyes that absorbed everything and reflected nothing back. He wore black. He always wore black. Not as affectation, but as erasure, as though he had decided years ago that anything beyond function was a concession to vanity, and vanity was a luxury reserved for men who had not yet learned what the world actually cost. He stopped 3 feet from the messenger and looked down at him the way a man looks at a stain on an otherwise clean floor. "Repeat what you told Voss." The messenger repeated it. Word for word, his voice shook on the final sentence about graves. Caedric's expression did not change. He stood perfectly still, processing the information the way a machine processes raw material, grinding it down, extracting the useful components, discarding the rest. The silence stretched until the messenger's breathing became audible, rapid, wet with fear. "Haldane tore the treaty," Caedric said finally. "Yes, Your Grace. In front of witnesses. The entire Southern Assembly, 40 lords and their retainers." Another silence. Longer this time. "Good." The messenger blinked. "Your Grace." But the Duke had already turned away, walking back toward the council chamber with the unhurried stride of a man who had just received exactly the information he needed. The door closed behind him. The guards reappeared. The messenger was escorted to a windowless room in the East Tower, where he would remain for 3 days before anyone remembered to release him. Inside the council chamber, Caedric settled into the high-backed obsidian chair at the head of the table and studied the territorial map spread across its surface. Red pins marked Ashbourne holdings. Black pins marked debts outstanding. Blue pins, clustered along the southern border like a disease spreading northward, marked the houses that had begun refusing payments. Chancellor Voss stood at the opposite end of the table, watching the Duke with the particular brand of vigilance that came from understanding exactly how dangerous the next 5 minutes could become. "Haldane has wanted this confrontation for 18 months, Voss said carefully. Tearing the treaty publicly was theater. He is trying to provoke you into a response that fractures the Northern Coalition. I know what he is trying to do. Then perhaps a measured response, a diplomatic envoy, something that demonstrates restraint without conceding. Restraint! Caedric said the word as though tasting something rotten. He leaned back in his chair and fixed Voss with those flat gray eyes. Tell me, Chancellor, when a dog bares its teeth at you, do you negotiate with the dog? Voss chose his next words with surgical precision. You put the dog down, but you do it quietly, so the other dogs do not realize what happened until it is too late to organize. The faintest shadow of approval crossed Caedric's face. It vanished immediately. Send riders to Haldane's 3 largest creditors, the Merchant Guild in Ashford, the Iron Syndicate in Crewe, and the Valmont shipping contracts through the Eastern Strait. I want every debt Haldane owes called in simultaneously. Full balance. No extensions. No grace period. That will bankrupt him within the season. That is the point. Voss hesitated. It was a microscopic hesitation, barely perceptible, but Caedric caught it the way a hawk catches movement in tall grass. Speak. The Valmont contracts, Voss said. Calling those debts involves the Valmont family directly, and the Valmont arrangement is already complicated. The temperature in the room dropped, not literally. The fire still burned in the massive stone hearth behind the Duke's chair, but something shifted in the quality of the air itself, some invisible pressure that made the Chancellor's chest tighten involuntarily. The Valmont arrangement, Caedric repeated, is not complicated. It is finalized. Lady Seraphine Valmont arrives in 6 weeks as contracted. Her family's debts to House Ashbourne are settled through the marriage alliance. The shipping contracts are a separate instrument. Call them in. Her father will interpret it as aggression. Her father sold his daughter to settle a gambling debt disguised as a trade negotiation. His interpretation of aggression is not my concern. Voss nodded once and left the chamber without another word. Caedric remained at the table alone. The fire crackled behind him. Wind battered the narrow windows set high in the stone walls. The map before him showed a kingdom held together by debt, threat, and the carefully maintained illusion that House Ashbourne's power was too absolute to challenge. Every red pin was a promise backed by steel. Every black pin was a chain wrapped around a noble family's throat. The system worked because it was built on a truth most rulers refused to accept. People did not respect strength. They respected the certainty that strength would be used. Caedric had learned this at 14 the night his father was murdered by his own brother during a succession dispute that the royal court politely classified as a hunting accident. He learned it again at 17 when he reclaimed Blackthorne Keep by executing 3 of his uncle's supporters in the courtyard while the rest of the garrison watched. He learned it every year since then, through every crushed rebellion, every ruined house, every enemy who mistook his silence for hesitation and discovered too late that it was calculation. The world was not built for mercy. It was built for the people willing to do what mercy forbade. He placed one finger on the blue pin marking the Valmont territory along the eastern coast. A minor house. Respectable bloodline. Modest holdings in maritime trade. Nothing that should have mattered to a man controlling half the kingdom's northern wealth. But the marriage had been his idea, not Voss's, not the council's. His. He removed his finger from the map and stood. There were 37 days until Lady Seraphine Valmont arrived at Blackthorne Keep. In that time, he intended to systematically dismantle Lord Haldane's financial empire, consolidate 3 disputed border territories, and ensure that every noble family in Westmere understood what happened to men who tore up treaties bearing his seal. Sentiment was a vulnerability he had amputated from himself years ago. The marriage was strategic, the woman was an instrument, nothing more. He told himself this with the absolute conviction of a man who had never once been wrong about his own motives, which was precisely why, for the first time in 20 years, he was lying. Seraphine Valmont spent the last night before her departure standing on the cliffs above her family's harbor, watching the merchant ships roll against their moorings in the dark water below. The wind cut through her gray wool cloak and stung her eyes, but she did not move. She had stood on these cliffs since she was a girl, watching ships leave and return, and she had always believed that if she studied the pattern long enough, she would understand something essential about survival. Ships that left the harbor always came back changed, scraped by storms, missing rigging, carrying different cargo than what they departed with. The sea did not care about intentions. It tested the hull, it tested the crew, and the ships that survived were never the strongest. They were the ones whose captains understood that adaptation was not weakness. It was the only form of strength that actually lasted. She would need that understanding now. "You do not have to do this." The voice came from behind her. Seraphine did not turn. She knew the sound of her brother's footsteps on gravel the way she knew the rhythm of the tide. "Yes, Emmerich, I do." Emmerich Valmont stepped up beside her. He was 23, 2 years younger, with their mother's auburn hair and their father's talent for looking perpetually worried. He carried a lantern that swung in the wind, throwing their shadows across the cliff's edge in long, distorted shapes. "Father's debts are not your responsibility. Father's debts will destroy this family if someone does not absorb them. The Duke offered a settlement. I accepted." "You accepted a cage." Seraphine finally looked at him. In the lantern light, her face was sharper than people expected, not soft, not traditionally beautiful in the way court painters preferred. Angular cheekbones, a wide mouth that settled naturally into an expression that could be mistaken for defiance or amusement, depending on who was interpreting it. Dark eyes that held a particular quality of attention, the kind that made powerful men uncomfortable because it suggested she was not just listening to what they said, but cataloging what they meant. "Every arrangement is a cage," she told him. "The question is whether you sit in it or take it apart from the inside." That sounds like something Mother would have said. Mother survived 18 years married to a man who gambled away 3 estates and a shipping fleet. She did not survive by hoping for rescue. She survived by learning the architecture of every room she was trapped in. Emmerich stared at her. The lantern swung between them. "He is dangerous, Sarah. The stories are stories, built by men who benefit from the fear those stories generate. I am not walking into Blackthorne Keep blind. I have spent 4 months reading every trade record, tax ledger, and territorial dispute connected to House Ashbourne. I know exactly how he holds power, and I know where the joints are." "The joints?" "Every structure has them. The points where load-bearing walls meet. The places where pressure, applied correctly, redistributes the entire weight. The Duke's system is built on financial coercion, not military force. His army is formidable, but it is his debt network that controls the kingdom. Remove enough financial leverage and the entire architecture shifts." Emmerich shook his head slowly. "You are talking about a political system as though it is an engineering problem. Everything is an engineering problem. People just prefer to pretend otherwise because engineering requires precision, and most people are terrified of precision. It means admitting there are consequences to every single decision, and most of us would rather believe in luck." The wind surged. The ships groaned below. "Write to me," Emmerich said finally. "Every week. And if he hurts you, then I will handle it the way Mother handled everything, by surviving until I find the lever that changes the equation." She embraced her brother quickly, fiercely, the way people embrace when they understand that the next time they meet, one of them will be someone different. Then she walked back toward the estate without looking at the harbor again. The journey to Blackthorne Keep took 11 days through progressively hostile terrain. The coastal greenery of Valmont territory gave way to the gray moorlands of the central provinces, then to the dense, black-timbered forests of the north, where sunlight seemed to arrive late and leave early, as though even the sky preferred not to linger. Seraphine traveled with a small retinue. 4 guards provided by her father as a diplomatic formality, 2 handmaidens who spoke very little and cried very quietly after dark when they thought she was sleeping, a steward named Garrett, who had served House Valmont for 30 years and who spent the entire journey looking at the northern horizon like a man watching a storm he could not outrun. On the 8th day, they passed through a village called Thornmark. The village was not destroyed. That was the wrong word. Destroyed implied violence, chaos, the kind of damage that comes from conflict. Thornmark was not destroyed. It was emptied. Systematically. Efficiently. The houses still stood. The fences still lined the road. The well in the village center still held water. But the people were gone. Every last one. And on the door of the largest building, the one that might have been an inn or a meeting hall, someone had nailed a single piece of parchment bearing the Ashbourne seal. "Tax default," Garrett said quietly from beside the carriage. The entire village was relocated to labor settlements in the eastern mines, standard practice for communities that fall behind on tribute. Seraphine stared at the empty buildings as the carriage rolled past. "Standard practice," she repeated. Under the previous duke, defaulting villages were given an additional season to recover. Under the current duke, the collection is immediate. No extensions. And the people? The families? Garrett was silent for a moment too long. "The mines are not discussed openly." Seraphine filed this information in the same part of her mind where she stored everything else she had learned about Caedric Ashbourne. Not with outrage. Outrage was a luxury for people who had the power to change things immediately. She stored it with precision. Another data point, another joint in the architecture, another pressure point she would need when the time came. Blackthorne Keep appeared on the 12th morning like a wound in the landscape. The castle erupted from a massive granite ridge overlooking a valley of black pine forests and frozen rivers. Its towers were darker than the surrounding stone, built from a mineral unique to the northern quarries that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The effect was unsettling. Where most castles seem to grow from the earth, Blackthorne Keep seemed to have been driven into it, like a blade forced through soil. The outer walls were 40 feet high. The gates were iron-banded oak, reinforced with steel brackets that showed no decoration, no heraldry, nothing except the functional reality of a barrier designed to keep things out and keep things in with equal effectiveness. As the carriage approached the main gate, Seraphine noticed the guards on the walls. There were too many of them, not for a fortress of this size. For a wedding. This was not a household preparing to receive a bride. This was a military installation operating at elevated alert. Every guard carried a crossbow in addition to a sword. Every wall position was doubled. The courtyard beyond the gate, visible through the narrowing gap as the doors opened, contained not flowers or ceremonial decorations, but supply wagons, weapon racks, and a line of war horses being fitted with armored barding. "Charming," Seraphine murmured. Garrett glanced at her nervously. She stepped from the carriage before anyone could assist her. The courtyard was vast and cold, the flagstones polished by decades of boots and hooves. Servants lined the far wall in 2 precise rows, heads bowed, hands clasped. Officers flanked the main entrance, and standing at the top of the stone staircase leading into the keep itself, flanked by Chancellor Voss and 3 members of the council, was Duke Caedric Ashbourne. He did not smile. He did not gesture in welcome. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched her cross the courtyard with the same expression he might have worn while inspecting a shipment of military supplies, evaluating, measuring, calculating the exact value of what had just arrived at his doorstep. Seraphine climbed the stairs without lowering her eyes. 12 steps. She counted them. Not from nervousness, but from the same instinct that made her count everything. Stairs, guards, exits. The number of seconds between the Chancellor's polite smile and the micro-flinch at the corner of his left eye. The exact distance between herself and the nearest doorway. She stopped 2 steps below the Duke. Protocol demanded she stop 3 steps below and curtsy. She knew this. She had studied Ashbourne court etiquette for weeks. The 2-step stop was deliberate, close enough to force him to look down at a sharper angle, close enough to enter the space that most people instinctively kept clear around him. close enough to see the almost imperceptible shift in his jaw when she did it. "Lady Valmont," Chancellor Voss began, "on behalf of House Ashbourne and the Northern Territories, we welcome—" "Your Grace," Seraphine said, cutting directly past the Chancellor and addressing the Duke. "Your courtyard has more crossbows than candelabras. Should I interpret that as a security concern or a decorating preference?" Silence. The servants did not breathe. The officers did not blink. Chancellor Voss's polite smile calcified into something resembling a death mask. Caedric studied her for 3 full seconds. Then his mouth moved. Not a smile. Not quite. Something closer to the expression of a man who had just discovered an unfamiliar species in a territory he believed he had fully mapped. "Lady Valmont," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, quieter, the kind of quiet that forced everyone around it to stop making noise. "You will find that Blackthorne Keep does not invest in decoration. It invests in certainty." "Certainty," she repeated, holding his gaze. "That is a generous word for what most people would call excessive force." "Most people," Caedric said, "are dead." He turned and walked into the keep without waiting for her. Voss gestured hurriedly for her to follow. The servants broke formation. The officers exchanged glances that contained entire conversations about what had just happened and what it meant for their continued employment. Seraphine climbed the final 2 steps and crossed the threshold into Blackthorne Keep. The great hall swallowed her. It was enormous. Cathedral-high ceilings supported by black stone columns carved with territorial markers instead of ornamentation. The chandeliers burned low, casting the room in amber half-light that made every shadow twice its natural size. The floor was dark marble, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the firelight from hearths large enough to stand inside. And it was cold, not temperature. The fires burned adequately. The cold was architectural, deliberate. Every surface was hard. Every angle was sharp. Every piece of furniture was positioned for function rather than comfort. The room did not invite occupation. It tolerated it. Caedric had stopped at the far end of the hall, near a table covered in documents and territorial maps. He had not looked back. He was already reading something, his attention redirected with the brutal efficiency of a man who categorized everything by utility and had already assigned his new bride a shelf. Seraphine studied the hall around her. She counted the exits, 4 visible, 2 sealed with iron brackets that suggested they were rarely used. She counted the guards, 6 in the hall itself, positioned at intervals that covered every sightline. She noted the placement of the hearths, the direction of the drafts that indicated hidden passages or structural gaps in the walls, the acoustic quality of the space that meant conversations at normal volume could be heard from the gallery above. Then she looked at the Duke's back. Broad shoulders, rigid spine. The posture of a man who had not relaxed a single muscle in the presence of another human being for so long that tension had become his resting state. His left hand rested on the table near the documents. His right hand hung at his side, fingers slightly curled, in the exact position a trained swordsman maintained when they expected to need a weapon within the next 3 seconds. He was afraid. Not of her. Not of anything so simple. He was afraid the way a man is afraid who has built an empire on the principle that vulnerability is extinction, and who now, for reasons he probably refused to examine, had voluntarily introduced an unknown variable into the most controlled environment in the kingdom. Seraphine filed this observation with everything else. Then she walked forward, her silver silk catching the firelight, and began learning the architecture of her cage. Well, the first week passed in a series of calculated encounters that neither of them acknowledged as tests. Caedric assigned her chambers in the East Tower, 3 floors above his own. The rooms were large, well-furnished, and positioned with a single staircase that could be sealed from below. Seraphine noted the lock placement on her first night and said nothing about it. Meals were taken in the small dining hall adjacent to the council chamber. Caedric ate efficiently, the way he did everything, consuming food as fuel rather than experience. He spoke rarely during meals and never about anything personal. The conversation, when it existed, concerned territorial reports, trade statistics, and the ongoing standoff with the southern lords. Seraphine listened to everything. On the 3rd evening, she asked her first question. "The villages along the eastern ridge," she said, setting down her knife with the deliberate calm of someone placing a chess piece. The tax records show collection rates 30% above the assessed value. The surplus is not appearing in the treasury accounts. Caedric's fork paused halfway to his mouth. It was a small pause. Anyone else would have missed it. You have been reading treasury records. I've been reading everything available in the East Tower Library. The treasury records were on the third shelf, between the military procurement ledgers and the mining output reports. They were not restricted, which means either you intended me to find them or your filing system has a significant oversight. I am curious which one it is. Voss, seated at the far end of the table, looked as though he wanted to dissolve into the stone wall behind him. Caedric set his fork down. The sound was precise, controlled. The sound of a man deciding how much truth to release into the room. Minister Aldrin manages the Eastern collections, he said. Minister Aldrin is skimming 30% off the top of every village assessment and redistributing it through a shell account in the Ashford Merchant Guild. The ledger entries are competent but not sophisticated. He is rotating the surplus through 3 separate transaction codes, but the timing pattern is consistent enough to identify within an hour of focused review. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with something Seraphine could not immediately name. Caedric stared at her across the table with an expression that contained no anger, no surprise, and no gratitude. It contained recognition. The particular dangerous recognition of a predator encountering something it had not anticipated. You identified this within 3 days. The discrepancy was obvious. The routing mechanism took slightly longer. And you are telling me rather than leveraging this information privately. Leveraging it privately would give me temporary advantage. Telling you directly establishes something more valuable, which is that I am not here to play the games your court plays. I am here to solve problems your court is too afraid to name. Caedric leaned back in his chair. The firelight shifted across his face, carving his features into planes of shadow and cold amber light. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he turned to Voss. Have Aldrin arrested tonight. Seize his personal accounts. I want a full audit on my table by morning. Your Grace, Minister Aldrin has served the council for... Did I ask for his biography? Voss closed his mouth. He stood, bowed, and left the dining hall with the controlled urgency of a man who understood that the political landscape had just shifted beneath his feet in a direction he had not mapped. Seraphine and Caedric sat alone in the flickering half-light. You are not what your father's correspondence described, Caedric said. My father's correspondence described a compliant daughter willing to fulfill a contractual obligation in exchange for debt settlement. He was half right. Which half? The debt settlement. Something moved behind Caedric's eyes. Not warmth, not softness. Something more primitive and more dangerous than either. The kind of involuntary recognition that happens when a system designed to operate in complete isolation encounters the first stimulus it cannot dismiss, categorize, or control. He stood without another word and left the dining hall. Seraphine remained at the table, listening to his boots recede down the corridor. She picked up her wine and drank slowly, studying the territorial map mounted on the wall opposite her seat. She had found the first joint. Now she needed to find the rest. And she needed to find them before Caedric Ashbourne discovered that the woman he had purchased as a strategic instrument was already, methodically, learning how to dismantle the machine he had built around himself. But what neither Seraphine nor the Duke could have known that night, as the wind screamed through the towers of Blackthorne Keep and the fire burned low in the empty dining hall, was that Chancellor Voss had not gone to arrest Minister Aldrin. He had gone to the rookery, and the raven he released into the frozen darkness carried a message bearing not the Ashbourne seal, but the crest of Lord Haldane. The man Caedric trusted most in the world had been selling his secrets for the better part of a decade, and the arrival of Seraphine Valmont had just given him the perfect weapon to finish what he started. The raven vanished into the northern sky like a splinter of darkness torn loose from the night itself, and Chancellor Aldrich Voss stood at the rookery window long after its shape dissolved into the storm clouds banking against the mountains. His hands were steady. They had always been steady. 31 years inside Blackthorne Keep had taught him that the body betrays the mind only when the mind permits uncertainty, and Voss had not been uncertain about anything since the night he watched the previous Duke die with an arrow through his lung and realized that the boy who would inherit the throne was not grieving. 14-year-old Caedric Ashbourne had stood over his father's corpse with dry eyes and asked a single question. Who benefits? Not who did this. Not why. Who benefits? Voss had recognized the shape of what was coming in that moment, a ruler who processed loss as data, a mind that converted pain into tactical information before the blood had cooled. He had spent 3 decades serving that mind, shaping it, feeding it the intelligence it required to function. And in return, that mind had consumed everything around it with the systematic efficiency of a fire that never goes out because someone keeps adding fuel. Voss was tired of being the fuel. He closed the rookery window. He descended the narrow stone staircase. He walked through the east corridor toward Minister Aldrin's chambers to perform the arrest as ordered, because the performance had to be flawless. Every instruction followed. Every expectation met. The Duke's most trusted advisor executing the Duke's will with characteristic precision. That was the architecture of the thing. You did not betray Caedric Ashbourne by defying him. Defiance was obvious. Defiance was a language he understood and could answer with overwhelming force. You betrayed him by being so perfectly loyal that the idea of your treachery became structurally impossible in his mind. You became load-bearing, and load-bearing elements were the last ones anyone thought to inspect. Voss knocked on Aldrin's door twice. The arrest took 4 minutes. Aldrin wept. Voss watched. The guards escorted the disgraced minister to the lower cells with the professional indifference of men who had performed this task many times and expected to perform it many more. Then Voss returned to his own chambers, poured a glass of wine, and sat in the dark, calculating exactly how much time he had before the Raven reached Lord Haldane and how much damage he could orchestrate in the interim. The woman was the variable. Seraphine Valmont was supposed to be simple, a minor house bride, a contractual instrument designed to settle debts and project political normalcy, the kind of decorative arrangement that northern aristocracy used to signal stability while the actual machinery of power operated unchanged beneath the surface. Every previous assumption about the marriage had been built on the premise that the Valmont woman would be manageable. 3 days inside Blackthorne Keep, and she had identified a financial corruption scheme that Voss himself had been using as leverage against Aldrin for 6 years. She was not manageable. She was a problem. And worse, she had the Duke's attention. Voss had watched Caedric during dinner. He had spent 31 years reading that man's face, cataloging the micro-expressions that other people missed because they were too afraid to look closely. The jaw tension, the fractional dilation of the pupils, the way his breathing shifted from its normal mechanical rhythm into something slightly uneven when Seraphine spoke. The Duke did not know what was happening to him. That was the dangerous part. Caedric Ashbourne had constructed an entire identity around the elimination of vulnerability, and now vulnerability was sitting across his dinner table wearing silver silk and dismantling his minister's embezzlement scheme with the casual precision of someone solving a moderately interesting puzzle. If she stayed, she would change him. And if he changed, the architecture of control that Voss had been selling to Lord Haldane for 9 years would shift in ways that made Voss's position untenable. He drank his wine slowly. The solution was not to remove Seraphine. Removing her would trigger exactly the kind of violent response that made Caedric unpredictable and therefore dangerous. The solution was to weaponize her, turn her presence into the mechanism of the Duke's unraveling, make her the fault line along which the entire structure cracked. Haldane would understand. Haldane always understood leverage. Voss set down his glass and went to bed. He slept well. He always slept well. Guilt was a luxury for men who still believed the world rewarded integrity. And Voss had abandoned that belief around the same time he abandoned the idea that serving Caedric Ashbourne would ever amount to anything more than elaborate, well-compensated captivity. 3 weeks passed. Seraphine learned the rhythms of Blackthorne Keep, the way a cartographer learns unfamiliar terrain, by walking every corridor, noting every pattern, measuring every distance between the things people said and the things they actually meant. The castle operated on fear. That much was obvious within the first 48 hours. But the specific mechanics of that fear were more sophisticated than the Southern propaganda suggested. Caedric did not rule through random violence. Random violence was inefficient. He ruled through predictability. Every punishment followed a known rule. Every consequence was proportional to its transgression, according to a system so internally consistent that the people living under it could not argue with its logic, even as it crushed them. That was the genius of it. And it was the flaw. Because a system built on perfect logic requires perfect information. And perfect information requires absolute trust in the channels delivering it. Seraphine was standing in the East Tower Library on the morning of her 23rd day at Blackthorne, when the door opened behind her and Caedric entered without announcement. She did not flinch. She had been expecting this. The Duke had a pattern of appearing without warning in spaces he considered his own, which meant every space inside the castle walls. It was a dominance behavior so deeply embedded in his operating system that he probably did not recognize it as such. He simply moved through his world as though other people's boundaries were architectural features he had never bothered to install. "You are still reading the Treasury records," he said. "I finished the Treasury records 9 days ago. I am reading the military procurement contracts for the eastern garrisons. Your supply chain has a bottleneck at the Crew Iron Works that adds 14 days to every weapons delivery. If Haldane moves against the border territories during the spring thaw, your eastern defenses will be undersupplied by approximately 3 weeks." Caedric stood in the doorway. He did not enter fully. That was new. Every other time he had appeared somewhere, he had occupied the center of the space immediately, the way a predator claims territory by positioning itself at the geometric point of maximum control. But now he stood at the threshold, one shoulder against the doorframe, watching her with an expression that was trying very hard to be evaluation and was not quite succeeding. "You identified a military vulnerability in procurement documents that 3 generals and a logistics minister failed to flag. Your 3 generals and your logistics minister are afraid of you, afraid people do not report problems. They report the version of reality most likely to keep them alive. And you are not afraid." Seraphine turned a page. "I did not say that." The air between them tightened, not with hostility, with something more complex and more unstable. The specific tension that exists when 2 people who understand power as a structural phenomenon suddenly find themselves operating inside each other's analytical range. "You are afraid," Caedric said. Not a question, a recalibration. "I am aware that I'm living inside a system designed to ensure my compliance. Awareness and fear are not the same thing, but they share a border." "And which side of the border are you standing on?" Seraphine looked up from the documents. Her dark eyes met his gray ones across 12 feet of cold library air. "Whichever side gives me the better vantage point." Caedric's jaw shifted. That micro-expression again. The one that was not a smile but lived in the same anatomical neighborhood. He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward the table where she sat, his boots marking the distance in measured, deliberate steps. He stopped close enough that she could smell the leather of his coat and the faint metallic undertone of weapons oil that never quite left his hands. "I have a council meeting in 1 hour," he said. "The subject is the Haldane situation. Attend." It was not an invitation. It was not a command either precisely. It occupied a space between the two that Seraphine recognized as the closest thing Caedric Ashbourne was capable of producing to a request. "The council will not appreciate my presence." "The council will adjust." He left the library. His footsteps faded down the corridor. Seraphine sat very still for a long time after he was gone. Her heartbeat had elevated during the conversation. She noted this clinically, the way she noted everything, but the clinical observation did not quite contain the thing she had felt when he stopped close enough to touch, and his gray eyes held hers without the usual flat, mineral distance. Something was shifting. In him. In her. In the invisible architecture between them. She was not sure yet whether it was useful or catastrophic. She closed the procurement ledger and went to prepare for the council meeting. The council chamber was a windowless room built into the central mass of Blackthorne Keep, accessible through a single reinforced door flanked by 2 guards who carried swords and the specific expression of men authorized to use them without seeking approval. Inside, a rectangular table of black oak dominated the space. 8 chairs, a territorial map covering the entire north wall, candelabras burning at full height, casting hard yellow light that eliminated shadows, and made every face in the room fully visible at all times. The room was designed for interrogation disguised as governance. 5 council members were already seated when Seraphine entered. She recognized Lord Cassian Rourke, the military commander, from the sharp scar bisecting his left cheek, and the way he held his chair like a man who expected to vacate it violently at any moment. Beside him sat the trade minister, a thin-lipped woman named Margrave, who controlled Ashbourne's commercial interests with the delicate brutality of a surgeon removing organs. The other three were financial advisors, territorial managers, men whose names Seraphine had memorized from the records, but whose faces she was cataloging now for the first time. Chancellor Voss sat at the Duke's right hand. He smiled at Seraphine when she entered. It was a perfect smile. Warm, welcoming, appropriately deferential to the Duke's bride. It contained absolutely nothing genuine, and Seraphine identified this instantly because the muscles around his eyes did not participate in the expression. The mouth moved. The cheeks lifted. The eyes remained exactly as they were, flat and calculating. The eyes of a man performing a role so practiced that the performance had become indistinguishable from nature. She filed it. "Lady Valmont," Voss said, "an unexpected pleasure." "I was invited." "Of course." Another perfect smile. "Please, sit." She took the empty chair at the far end of the table, not beside the Duke, not in a position of implied authority. At the end, where she could see every face in the room simultaneously without turning her head. Caedric entered last. The room temperature dropped 2 degrees in psychological terms. Every spine straightened. Every voice stopped. The Duke sat, opened a leather folio containing field reports, and began without preamble. "Haldane has moved 1,200 men to the border town of Greymarch. Supply wagons have been spotted on the eastern road for 6 consecutive days. He is not posturing. He is building a staging position." Lord Rourke leaned forward. "Greymarch is defensible but isolated. If he commits forces there, his western flank opens. We could move the 2nd Company through the Ashford corridor and cut his supply line within a week." "And leave our own eastern garrisons exposed," Seraphine said. Every head in the room turned toward her. Lord Rourke's scarred face arranged itself into an expression that fell somewhere between confusion and offense. "My lady, with respect, this is a military. Your eastern garrisons are 3 weeks behind on weapons procurement due to a bottleneck at the Crewe Ironworks. If you redirect the 2nd Company west, you strip the only adequately supplied force from the region most vulnerable to a secondary attack. Haldane is not building one staging position. He is building a diversion." Silence. Rourke looked at Caedric. The Duke's face gave him nothing. "She is correct," Caedric said. Rourke's jaw tightened. He looked back at Seraphine with the particular resentment of a professional who has just been outperformed in his own domain by someone he had already dismissed. "And what would the lady suggest?" "I would suggest not asking the question in a tone designed to communicate that you do not actually want an answer." Margrave, the trade minister, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Caedric's finger traced a line on the map. "Continue, Lady Valmont." Seraphine stood. She walked to the territorial map on the north wall and placed her finger on Greymarch, then traced the supply route Haldane would need to maintain. Haldane's weakness has never been military. It is financial. His 3 largest creditors are already under pressure from the debt calls His Grace initiated. If we accelerate the Ashford Merchant Guild's collection while simultaneously offering the Crewe Iron Syndicate a preferential contract renewal contingent on deprioritizing Haldane's orders, we collapse his supply chain without mobilizing a single soldier. His 1,200 men at Greymarch become 1,200 men with diminishing provisions, deteriorating equipment, and no clear path to resupply. He either withdraws or commits to a campaign he cannot sustain. The room was very quiet. Voss watched Seraphine from his seat with an expression that had not changed since she began speaking. The perfect smile was gone now. In its place was something more honest and infinitely more dangerous. Attention, real attention, the kind of focused awareness that a man directs at a threat he has just recategorized from theoretical to operational. That strategy assumes Haldane does not have alternative funding sources, Voss said. His voice was measured, careful, each word selected and placed like a stone in a wall being built very quickly. "It assumes nothing," Seraphine replied. "It forces him to reveal whether he has alternative funding sources by removing the ones we can verify. If he sustains operations after the financial collapse, We will know immediately that someone is backing him from inside the system. She did not look at Voss when she said this. She did not need to. The observation was general, structural, aimed at the logic of the situation rather than any specific person, but Voss heard it the way a man hears a sound in a dark room that might be nothing and might be the click of a lock opening behind him. Caedric studied the map for a long moment. Then he issued orders. The Ashford collections would accelerate. The crew contracts would be restructured. Lord Rourke would reinforce the eastern garrisons rather than redeploying west. Margrave would monitor Haldane's commercial activity for any unexplained revenue streams. The council members stood. They filed out. Rourke left without looking at Seraphine. Margrave looked at her briefly and nodded once. The nod of someone acknowledging a piece had just been added to the board that changed the geometry of the entire game. Voss was the last to leave. He paused at the door, turned back, looked at Seraphine, who was still standing by the map, and at the Duke, who was still seated, watching her. "A productive session," Voss said. Then he left, and the door closed behind him. Seraphine and Caedric were alone. "You undermined my military commander in front of the full council," Caedric said. "I corrected an incomplete analysis. If your military commander interprets accurate information as undermining, his problem is not with me. His problem is that you are doing in weeks what he has failed to do in years." "And what is that?" Caedric stood. He walked toward her, slowly. Not with the controlled, predatory stride he used in public. Something different. Something that lacked the performance of authority and contained instead the raw, undecorated movement of a man drawn toward something against the explicit instructions of every survival instinct he possessed. He stopped 2 feet from her. The map was behind her. The table was to her left. The door was 15 feet to her right. She had counted. "Making me reconsider the way I see things," he said. His voice was quiet. Not the commanding quiet he used in council. A different quiet. Stripped down. Almost uncertain, though the word itself probably did not exist in his vocabulary. Seraphine's pulse elevated. She noted it. She could not contain it. "That is not what I am trying to do." "I know. That is what makes it effective." The space between them was 2 feet. Then it was less. He had not moved. She had not moved. But the distance had compressed in some way that had nothing to do with physical geometry and everything to do with the mutual recognition that whatever existed between them was no longer operating within the parameters either of them had designed. His hand came up, slowly, as though the gesture cost him something he could not calculate. His fingertips touched the edge of her jaw, tracing the line of bone beneath the skin with the careful, almost clinical precision of a man handling something he understood was volatile. Seraphine did not pull away. She did not lean in. She held perfectly still and watched his gray eyes from a distance measured in inches. And what she saw there was not the flat, mineral surface she had catalogued on the day she arrived. Something had cracked behind it. Something raw and unmanaged and fundamentally terrified. The kind of terror that comes from discovering that the fortress you built to protect yourself has a door you never installed and someone just walked through it. "This is a complication," she said. "Yes. For both of us. Yes." His hand dropped. He stepped back. The distance returned. The mask resettled over his features like water closing over a stone. He picked up his leather folio from the table, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the door with the measured stride of a man reassembling himself in real time. He paused at the threshold. "The council meets again in 3 days. Attend." He left. Seraphine stood alone in the council chamber. Her hand rose to her jaw, touching the place where his fingertips had been. Her heartbeat took a long time to normalize. She was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble she had prepared for. Not political, not strategic, not the cold, calculable danger of living inside a tyrant's machinery. The kind of trouble that existed in the space between what a person planned and what a person felt. The kind that could not be solved with ledgers, supply chain analysis, or an engineering approach to power structures. The kind that burned. Book it. 1,200 miles south, Lord Haldane read the Raven's message by candlelight. The wax seal bore no crest. The handwriting was Voss's, disguised but recognizable to a man who had been receiving these messages for nearly a decade. The contents were brief, clinical, devastating. The Valmont woman has the Duke's confidence. She identified Aldrin within 3 days. She presented military strategy to the full council today. He listened. He is changing. If you intend to move, the window is narrowing. Haldane set the message down and looked across the table at the man seated opposite him. The man wore a traveling cloak still damp from the road. His face was forgettable by design, the kind of face that moved through crowded rooms without registering in anyone's memory. How many men can you place inside Blackthorne within the month? The man considered. 8, 12 if you need them expendable. I need them invisible. The target is not the Duke. The man raised an eyebrow. The target is the woman. Remove her, and the Duke reverts to what he was. Predictable. Isolated. Manageable. And if the Duke retaliates? Haldane smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been playing a game for 9 years and had just been handed the card he needed to end it. The Duke will not retaliate, because when she disappears, every piece of evidence will point to the one person he trusts completely. And when Caedric Ashbourne discovers that his own chancellor orchestrated the abduction of his Duchess, he will not march south. He will turn inward. He will destroy his own council, his own command structure, his own capacity to govern. We will not need to defeat him. He will dismantle himself. The man nodded once. Haldane burned the message. The flame consumed the parchment in 3 seconds. The ash drifted to the floor like black snow. Somewhere in the far north, inside a fortress built on control and sustained by fear, a duke who had never allowed himself to want anything was beginning to want something he could not control. And every person who understood what that meant was already sharpening a blade designed specifically for the opening it would create. The first assassin arrived at Blackthorne Keep disguised as a farrier's apprentice on the morning supply convoy from Crewe. He carried forged guild papers, a toolkit that contained 3 concealed blades behind a false leather panel, and enough knowledge of horseshoe fitting to survive 2 days of inspection before anyone thought to question why a farrier's apprentice had the calluses of a swordsman rather than a blacksmith. The second arrived 4 days later as a replacement scullery worker. The third came embedded within a merchant delegation delivering salted provisions for the winter stores. The fourth, 5th, and 6th infiltrated across the following week through separate channels, each entering through a different gate, each carrying a different cover identity, each reporting to a handler they had never met face-to-face and would never see again once the operation was complete. By the end of the month, 8 of Haldane's operatives occupied positions throughout Blackthorne Keep, moving through the daily machinery of the castle with the invisible efficiency of blood cells circulating through a body that did not know it was sick. Voss knew about none of them. That was the elegance of Haldane's design. The Chancellor believed he was the architect of the conspiracy. He believed the Raven messages constituted a partnership between equals, an exchange of intelligence for mutual benefit. He did not understand that he had been a tool from the beginning, a delivery mechanism for information that Haldane needed, and that the endgame had always included his destruction as part of the cost structure. Because Haldane did not need allies, he needed someone to blame, and a chancellor who had been secretly communicating with the enemy for 9 years was the most convincing scapegoat in the kingdom. Seraphine noticed the anomalies on the 14th day of the second month. It started with the supply records. She had developed a habit of reviewing the castle's intake logs every 3 days, cross-referencing personnel arrivals against the authorized staffing manifest that Voss maintained. It was a compulsion she could not entirely explain, the same instinct that made her count exits and measure distances and catalog the micro-expressions on the faces of men who smiled at her in corridors. She did not trust systems she could not audit. She had never trusted systems she could not audit. And Blackthorne Keep was a system with too many moving parts and not enough transparency for her comfort. The discrepancy was small. A farrier's apprentice logged in the convoy manifest who did not appear on the guild's quarterly assignment rotation. A scullery replacement authorized by the kitchen steward, but not countersigned by the household marshal. Individual irregularities that meant nothing in isolation, and everything when plotted against each other on a timeline. She brought the records to the East Tower Library and spread them across the table. She worked for 3 hours, matching names against authorizations against the castle's internal movement logs. By the end of the 3rd hour, she had identified 6 personnel additions over 28 days that did not conform to Blackthorne's standard intake procedures. 6 people inside the castle who should not be there. She sat back in her chair and pressed her knuckles against her lips, thinking. The logical step was to bring this to Caedric, but the logical step assumed that the infiltration was external, that whoever had placed these operatives inside the castle had done so without assistance from someone already embedded in the Duke's administrative infrastructure. And the staffing manifests that authorized these arrivals all bore the same countersignature. Voss. Seraphine stared at the Chancellor's name on the documents. It was possible that the authorizations were legitimate and the paperwork gaps were simply bureaucratic oversights. Possible, but not probable. Not in a castle where the Chancellor controlled every administrative function with the kind of obsessive precision that came from 31 years of survival under a ruler who treated inefficiency as a personal insult. If Voss had authorized these arrivals, he had done so deliberately. And if Voss was compromised, then telling Caedric created a chain reaction she could not predict. The Duke would respond with the only tool he understood when trust fractured. Annihilation. Complete, structural, indiscriminate. He would tear through his own council, his own command structure, his own intelligence network, because the alternative was admitting that the man he had trusted most had been operating against him, and that admission would require confronting a vulnerability so fundamental that Caedric's entire psychological architecture would crack under its weight. She needed proof. Not suspicion, not pattern analysis. Proof that could be presented in a way that gave Caedric room to act strategically rather than destructively. She had approximately 48 hours to find it before the Winter Sovereign Ball, when every noble house in the Northern Territories would fill Blackthorne's Great Hall with enough political complexity to provide cover for whatever operation those 6 unauthorized personnel had been placed inside the castle to execute. Seraphine closed the records, locked the library door, and began working. Caedric spent the 2 days before the ball in the war room, managing the accelerating crisis on the southern border with the cold, systematic efficiency that had kept him alive for 20 years. Haldane's financial position was deteriorating exactly as Seraphine's strategy predicted. The Crew Iron Syndicate had deprioritized Haldane's contracts. The Ashford Merchant Guild was pressing collections with the enthusiasm of men who understood that siding with House Ashbourne was not optional. Intelligence reports showed supply shortages at the Grey March staging position. Everything was working. And Caedric could not stop the feeling that something was wrong. It was not a thought. It was lower than thought. A sensation in the muscles along his spine, the kind of physical awareness that had saved his life 3 times in military campaigns, because the body processed threat faster than the mind could articulate it. His shoulders were tighter than usual. His sleep had deteriorated from its standard 4 hours to something fragmented and shallow, interrupted by the kind of formless alertness that came from sensing movement in the dark. He stood at the war room table at 2 in the morning, studying maps he had already memorized, and admitted to himself that the source of his unease was not the southern border. It was her. Not because she threatened him, the opposite, because she had stopped being a variable he could manage and had become something he did not have a category for. In 6 weeks, she had restructured his eastern financial operations, identified a military vulnerability his own commanders had missed, and sat in his council chamber delivering strategic analysis with the composure of someone who had been doing it for decades rather than days. And when he had touched her jaw in the council chamber 2 weeks ago, the look in her eyes had not been fear or calculation or the careful performance of attraction that court women deployed as political currency. It had been recognition. The specific, devastating recognition of one isolated mind finding another and understanding without words the exact shape and cost of that isolation. He had not touched her since. He had not allowed himself within arm's reach of her since, because the touch had revealed something he could not afford to acknowledge. That the fortress he had built was not protecting him from the world. It was protecting the world from discovering that the Duke of Blackthorne was not the machine he performed. That beneath the control and the calculations and the systematic elimination of everything soft, there was still the 14-year-old standing over his father's body who had asked, "Who benefits?" Not because he did not feel grief, but because the grief was so enormous that converting it into tactical information was the only way to prevent it from destroying him entirely. Seraphine had looked at him and seen the boy. No one had ever seen the boy. He could not allow that to continue, and he could not make it stop. Caedric placed both hands on the war table and leaned forward, his weight pressing into the wood. His breathing was uneven. He recognized this the way he recognized all physical symptoms, as data, as information about a system operating outside its designed parameters. But recognizing the symptom did not resolve the underlying condition. And the underlying condition was that for the first time in his adult life, he wanted something that could not be acquired through force, leverage, or strategic calculation. He wanted to be known. And wanting to be known, in the world he had built, was the most dangerous thing he could possibly want. The Winter Sovereign Ball began at sundown. Blackthorne's great hall had been transformed into something that almost resembled beauty, if beauty could be constructed from threat. Thousands of candles burned in the iron chandeliers, casting warm light across cold stone. Banquet tables ran the length of the hall, draped in black cloth and laden with silver service. An orchestra occupied the raised gallery, filling the space with music that echoed off the vaulted ceiling and created a sound environment dense enough to mask the dozens of political conversations happening simultaneously beneath it. 300 nobles filled the hall, lords and ladies from every northern territory, dressed in winter finery that cost more than most villages produced in a year. Jewels caught the candlelight. Silk rustled against marble. Laughter rang with the specific frequency of people performing enjoyment while their eyes tracked every movement in the room for signs of advantage or danger. Seraphine entered in silver, the same color she had worn on her first day at Blackthorne, but the dress was different, closer cut, more deliberate. The choice of a woman who understood that clothing was communication and who had decided tonight to communicate something specific. She crossed the hall with her head level and her stride unhurried, cataloging the room as she moved. She had not found proof of Voss's treachery. 48 hours of investigation had produced circumstantial patterns, financial irregularities in the Chancellor's personal accounts, communication gaps in the rookery logs that suggested unauthorized raven traffic, but nothing definitive enough to present to Caedric without triggering the catastrophic response she was trying to prevent. She had decided to watch. Tonight, in a room full of political actors performing their roles at maximum intensity, someone would make a mistake. Someone always made a mistake when the stakes were high enough because maintaining deception required energy, and energy depleted under pressure. And the Winter Sovereign Ball was the highest pressure environment in the Northern Territories. She found Caedric at the far end of the hall, standing near the obsidian chair that served as his informal throne. He wore black, as always, but the formal military cut of his coat carried silver detailing along the shoulders and collar that she had not seen before. He had dressed for the occasion. The realization that this man, who treated aesthetics as irrelevant, had made a sartorial decision for an event where she would be present told her more about what was happening inside him than any conversation they had shared. Their eyes met across 40 feet of crowded hall. He did not smile. She did not smile. But something passed between them in that moment, a current of mutual awareness so intense that Margrave, standing 6 feet from the Duke, actually turned to look at what he was staring at, and then looked away quickly with the expression of a woman who had just witnessed something she was absolutely not supposed to see. "Your Grace," Seraphine reached him and offered the minimal curtsy that protocol demanded. "Your hall cleans up well." "My hall is performing a function, the same function this entire evening is designed to perform." "Which is?" "Convincing 300 people that the man they fear also knows how to host a dinner party. It is the most efficient form of propaganda, terror and hospitality in the same room. They cannot reconcile the two, so they default to compliance." "You have a gift for making social events sound like military operations." "Everything is a military operation. Some people use swords. Some people use candelabras." Seraphine almost smiled. She caught herself and converted the expression into something more neutral, but not before Caedric registered the shift and filed it with the particular intensity of a man collecting evidence of something he was not ready to name. The evening progressed. Nobles circulated. Alliances were tested and reinforced through the complex social choreography of shared drinks, strategic proximity, and conversations that operated on 3 levels simultaneously. Seraphine moved through the crowd with the deliberate patience of someone working a grid pattern, engaging each cluster of nobles long enough to assess their loyalties and short enough to avoid being drawn into commitments. She was watching Voss. The Chancellor worked the room with his characteristic precision, greeting nobles, facilitating introductions, managing the political temperature with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this for decades. His smile was impeccable. His timing was flawless. He moved from group to group like a conductor, ensuring every section of the orchestra hit its marks at exactly the right moment. But twice during the first hour, Seraphine saw him glance toward the service corridor behind the orchestra gallery. Brief glances, less than a second each, the kind of look a person gives when checking on something they are expecting to happen. The third time he did it, she followed his sight line. The service corridor was empty, almost empty. In the shadowed alcove beside the gallery stairs, a man stood with his back against the wall and his hands clasped in front of him. He wore servant's livery. His posture was wrong. Servants at formal events maintained a specific physical vocabulary, shoulders rounded, eyes down, bodies oriented toward the nearest point of service. This man stood with his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, his shoulders squared, his eyes tracking the room with the systematic sweep pattern of someone trained in tactical observation. He was one of the six. Seraphine's pulse spiked. She controlled it. She turned back to the noble she was speaking with, smiled, nodded at whatever had just been said, and excused herself with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to exit conversations without creating memorable departures. She needed to find Caedric. She needed to find him now. She turned toward the obsidian chair. Caedric was not there. She scanned the hall, 300 faces, candlelight and jewels and silk and the thundering orchestra above. She could not find him. The crowd was too dense, the lighting too inconsistent, the room too large for a quick visual sweep to locate a single man, even a man who normally dominated every space he occupied. Then she heard the sound. It came from beyond the great hall, through the east corridor that connected to the council chamber. A door slamming. Not the controlled, measured sound of a door being closed by someone who owned the building. The sharp, violent crack of a door driven into its frame by force. Seraphine moved. She crossed the hall quickly, weaving through the crowd without running, her silver dress catching the candlelight as she passed the orchestra gallery and entered the east corridor. The music faded behind her. The corridor was cold, lit by intermittent torches that threw more shadow than light. Voices ahead. Two voices. One she recognized immediately. Caedric. The other was Voss. She slowed. She pressed herself against the corridor wall and moved forward until she could see through the partially open door of the council chamber. Caedric stood at the head of the table. In front of him, spread across the black oak surface, were documents. Raven message transcripts, financial records, communication logs bearing dates that spanned back years. His face was not angry. Anger would have been manageable. Anger was an emotion he understood and could weaponize. What his face showed was something far more dangerous. Blankness. The total, catastrophic blankness of a man whose operating system had just encountered information it was not designed to process. Voss stood at the opposite end of the table. His perfect composure was intact, but Seraphine could see the strain beneath it. The tendons in his neck were visible. His hands, clasped behind his back, were white at the knuckles. "How long?" Caedric's voice was barely audible. Not quiet, emptied. The sound of a man speaking from inside a vacuum. Voss said nothing. "How long, Aldrich?" "Your Grace, these documents are fabricated. Someone has constructed a 9 years. Caedric picked up one of the transcripts and held it toward the candlelight. His hand was steady, perfectly steady. The steadiness of a man holding himself together through pure mechanical force while something underneath collapsed at speed. The first message is dated 9 years ago, 3 months after the border dispute with House Kendrick. You provided Haldane with our troop deployments, our financial positions, and the identities of 4 intelligence operatives working inside his territory. 2 of those operatives were found dead within weeks of this message. I did not. You killed Marcus Webb. You killed Eleanor Thorne. They trusted me, and I sent them into territory where the enemy already knew their names because the man I trusted most in this castle sold them for whatever Haldane offered. Caedric set the transcript down. His movements were mechanical, precise. The movements of a man who understood that if he allowed his body to express what was actually happening inside him, the expression would be violent enough to bring the walls down. Those documents appeared on my table tonight, during the ball. While 300 witnesses fill my hall, someone wanted me to find this now, in this specific context, at this specific moment. That is not accident, that is orchestration. Voss's composure cracked by a millimeter. Then consider the possibility that the orchestration is not mine, that someone is using these documents to destroy the alliance between us precisely when there is no alliance between us. Caedric's voice dropped to a register Seraphine had never heard. Below anger, below cold, the sound of bedrock fracturing. There was a man I built my kingdom around, and that man has been a doorway my enemies walked through for 9 years. Seraphine watched Voss's face recalculate in real time. The denial was failing. The documents were too detailed, too comprehensive, too precisely dated against events only someone with intimate access to Ashbourne intelligence could have provided. He was running out of structural defenses. "Everything I have done," Voss said slowly, and his voice changed now, the performance dropping away, the smooth diplomatic cadence replaced by something flatter and harder. The voice of the actual man beneath the role has been in service of keeping this castle standing. You have no concept of what it costs to maintain the machinery you rely on. You sit in your chair and issue commands, and the world rearranges itself because I make it rearrange. For 31 years, without recognition, without trust beyond the functional, without anything except the privilege of being the man Caedric Ashbourne has not decided to destroy yet. So this is what? Compensation. This is survival. The same survival instinct you built your entire identity around. You do not get to claim that instinct as a virtue when it serves you and condemn it as betrayal when it serves someone else. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the sound of two men standing in the wreckage of a relationship that had defined both their lives, listening to the structural failure propagate through every assumption they had built on top of it. Caedric reached for his belt. "Your Grace." Seraphine stepped through the doorway. Both men turned. Voss's face went white. Caedric's hand stopped 6 inches from the blade at his hip. "Not here," Seraphine said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Not tonight. 300 nobles in the next room, and every one of them is listening for exactly this kind of rupture." "This does not concern you," Caedric said. "It concerns everyone in this castle. If you kill him now, without trial, without public accounting, every noble house in the north will use it as proof that you govern through impulse rather than law. Haldane's entire strategy depends on you reacting exactly like this, destroying your own infrastructure, turning inward, becoming the tyrant they already call you." Caedric stared at her. His hand had not moved from its position near the blade. His gray eyes were not flat anymore. They were burning. The cold mineral surface had shattered, and behind it was something incandescent and terrible. The accumulated fury of a man who had trusted once, truly trusted, and discovered that the trust had been a weapon pointed at him the entire time. "He sold my people to the enemy." "Yes, and he will answer for it. But not in this room, not in this hour, not while Haldane's operatives are inside this castle, waiting for exactly the chaos you are about to create." Caedric's breathing stopped. "What operatives?" 6, possibly 8, infiltrated over the past month through personnel intake gaps in the staffing manifests. I identified the pattern 4 days ago. I was trying to find definitive proof before bringing it to you, because I knew that the information about Voss combined with an active infiltration would push you past the point where strategic response was possible. Caedric looked at her, then at Voss, then back at her. His hand dropped from the blade. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle trembled visibly beneath the skin. "You knew about Voss." "I suspected. I did not have proof until tonight. You withheld intelligence about a threat to my security. I withheld suspicion about a threat to your judgment. There is a difference. And the fact that we are having this conversation instead of standing over a body in a room where 300 nobles can hear the screaming is the proof that the difference matters." The room was very still. Voss had not moved. He stood at the far end of the table with the resigned stillness of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine whether he lived or died, and that the decision was no longer in his hands. It was in hers. Caedric turned his back on both of them. He faced the territorial map on the wall. His reflection in the polished surface was distorted, fractured by the candlelight into something barely recognizable. When he spoke, his voice came from a place she had never heard before. Not the commander, not the machine, not the weapon, something underneath all of it, raw and cracked and stripped of every layer of performance that had kept him functional for 20 years. I built everything on the principle that if I controlled enough, nothing could reach me. That if the system was airtight, the system would protect me. And the system was a lie. Held together by a man who was feeding my enemies for a decade. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone wall. Everything I know about how to survive this, every tool I have, every instinct, all of it was built for a world where I operate alone, where trust is a liability, where the only reliable variable is force. He turned. He looked at Seraphine, and in that look was something she had never seen on another human face. The expression of a man standing at the exact edge of what he was, staring into the space where what he needed to become existed, and understanding that crossing that distance would require dismantling the only version of himself he knew how to operate. Those tools will not work tonight, will they? It was not a question. Seraphine held his gaze. No, they will not. Then tell me what will. The Duke of Blackthorne, the most feared man in Westmere, stood in the wreckage of everything he had built and asked the only person who had ever seen through him for help he did not know how to accept. And in the great hall beyond the corridor, 300 nobles drank and danced beneath the chandeliers, unaware that the empire they feared was fracturing from the inside, and that the only thing standing between order and annihilation was a woman in silver who had 48 hours to rebuild a broken man's capacity for trust before his enemies used his destruction against him. Seraphine answered him in the only language that could penetrate the wreckage of what he was feeling. She answered him with logistics. Voss goes to the lower cells. Quietly. 2 guards you trust with your life, not your reputation. He does not speak to anyone between this room and the cell door. The nobles in the hall cannot know what has happened until we control the narrative. If word spreads tonight that your chancellor has been operating for Haldane, every alliance you hold fractures before sunrise. Caedric stared at her. His breathing was still ragged, but his eyes had shifted. The incandescent fury was cooling into something harder, something functional, the way molten iron cools into a blade when forced into a mold. She was giving him the mold. Structure. Sequence. A series of actions that did not require him to process what he was feeling, only to move. The operatives, he said. I have physical descriptions for 3, approximate locations for 2 more based on the duty rosters they were assigned to. The remaining 3 I can identify if I get access to the household marshal's intake logs from the past 30 days. You memorize the duty rosters. I memorize everything. Caedric turned to Voss. The Chancellor had not moved. He stood at the end of the table with the stillness of a man who had accepted that the remainder of his life would be measured in the decisions of other people and had decided that stillness was the only dignity available to him. You will go with my guards, Caedric said. You will not speak. Voss looked at him. For the first time since Seraphine had entered the room, something authentic crossed the Chancellor's face. Not remorse, not fear. Something more complicated and more human. The expression of a man seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time in decades, the full scope of what his choices had cost. For what it is worth, Voss said, she is the best thing that ever happened to this castle. Do not speak to me about her. I'm not speaking to you about her. I'm telling you what I should have told you years ago about yourself. You were never the machine, Caedric. You were a man pretending to be a machine because a machine cannot be hurt. And the pretending has cost you everything except the one thing you were too afraid to want. Caedric's hand twitched toward his blade. Seraphine stepped between them. Not dramatically, not with any gesture that could be interpreted as defiance. She simply occupied the space between the 2 men with the quiet authority of someone who understood that the next 3 seconds would determine the trajectory of the entire night. Guards, she said. Now. Caedric exhaled through his teeth. He crossed to the door, opened it, and spoke to the 2 sentries outside in a voice so low that Seraphine could not hear the words. The guards entered. They flanked Voss. The Chancellor walked between them without resistance, his posture erect, his hands clasped behind his back in the exact position he had maintained for 31 years of service. The door closed behind him. Seraphine and Caedric stood alone in the council chamber. The orchestra music bled through the stone walls in muffled, distorted waves. 300 nobles danced and drank and schemed 40 feet away, separated from the implosion of everything they feared by a corridor and a closed door. "How long do we have?" Caedric said. "If the operatives are on a timed schedule, they will move tonight. The ball provides maximum chaos and minimum visibility. If they are waiting for a signal from Voss, we have until they realize the signal is not coming. Either way, hours, not days." "What is the target?" Seraphine met his eyes. "Me." The word landed in the room like a blade driven into wood. Caedric's entire body went still. Not the controlled stillness she had catalogued over the past weeks. A different kind. The stillness of a man whose nervous system had just received information that bypassed every cognitive filter and struck something primitive, something that existed below strategy and calculation in the basement of the brain where survival instinct lived alongside the few things a human being would kill for without hesitation. "Explain." "Haldane does not need to defeat you militarily. He needs to destabilize you. The most efficient way to destabilize a system built on one person's control is to remove the variable that person cannot afford to lose. 3 months ago, that variable did not exist. Now it does. Haldane knows this because Voss told him. Every Raven message for the past 2 months has detailed how I have influenced your decisions, your strategy, your behavior. Haldane is not targeting your Duchess. He is targeting your weakness." She said it without flinching, without softening, without the diplomatic padding that most people would have applied to the act of telling the most dangerous man in the kingdom that he had a weakness and that she was it. Caedric absorbed the information. She watched the processing happen in real time, the way his jaw set, the way his breathing regulated, the way his shoulders squared as his body converted emotional devastation into operational readiness. He was rebuilding himself in front of her, brick by brick, taking the wreckage of the last 20 minutes and reassembling it into something that could function. But the architecture was different this time. She could see it in the way he looked at her, not through her, not past her, not with the evaluative distance he had maintained since her arrival. He looked at her the way a man looks at the one fixed point in a landscape that is collapsing, and his eyes carried something she had never seen in them before. Not possession, not the cold proprietary intensity she had expected from a man told that the woman in his castle was a target. Fear. Genuine, unprocessed, ungovernable fear. The kind that only exists when a person has discovered something they cannot survive losing and has not yet built the defenses to protect against the discovery. "I will kill every one of them," he said. "You will find every one of them. And then we will decide together what happens next." The word "together" hit him like a physical impact. She saw it register in the micro-flinch at the corner of his left eye, the fractional tightening of his throat, the way his hands opened and closed at his sides as though reaching for something he did not know how to hold. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I know. I have never operated with someone else inside the decision. I do not have the architecture for it." "Then build it, right now, tonight. Because the architecture you had was a lie held together by a man who was selling you to your enemies. And if you try to fight what is coming with the same tools that failed you, you will lose. Not the battle, yourself." The orchestra swelled in the great hall. The candles in the council chamber flickered as a draft moved through the corridor. Somewhere in the castle, 8 men waited for a signal or a schedule or whatever trigger would convert them from dormant threats into active ones. Caedric looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he moved. What? The next 90 minutes were the most precisely coordinated operation Blackthorne Keep had ever executed, and they were conducted entirely in whispers. Caedric pulled Lord Rourke from the ball first. The military commander's scarred face showed surprise for approximately half a second before the soldier underneath took over, and the expression became the flat professional readiness of a man who had been waiting his entire career for this exact type of crisis. 8 hostiles embedded in staff. I need them identified, isolated, and neutralized without a single noble in that hall knowing anything has changed. Rourke did not ask how. He asked where. Seraphine provided the descriptions and locations she had compiled. 3 confirmed identities, 2 probable locations, 3 unknowns that would need to be flushed through a systematic sweep of the service corridors, kitchens, and stable block. Rourke deployed his men in pairs, no armor, no visible weapons beyond the standard sidearms that castle guards carried at formal events. The order was to contain, not to kill, because dead operatives could not provide intelligence about Haldane's broader network, and Seraphine needed that intelligence to understand the full scope of what they were facing. Caedric disagreed with the containment order. Dead men do not communicate with their handlers, Seraphine told him in the corridor outside the council chamber while Rourke's teams moved through the castle like ghosts. If we kill them, Haldane knows immediately that his operation has failed. If we capture them silently, he receives no information. Silence is more useful than violence tonight. Silence has never been more useful than violence in any situation I have encountered. Then your encounters have been limited. He looked at her. In the torchlight of the corridor, with the muffled music behind them and the sound of armed men moving quietly through the service passages around them, his face held an expression she was learning to read. The expression of a man who was not accustomed to being challenged and was discovering against every instinct he possessed that he did not want it to stop. If any of them reach you, they will not reach me because your plan will work, and because Lord Rourke's men are competent, and because I will be in the Great Hall surrounded by 300 witnesses, which is the last place an operative on a covert mission wants to create an incident. You are using yourself as bait. I am using myself as a known variable in a predictable location. There is a difference. The difference is academic. If someone puts a blade in you, then make sure they do not. She held his gaze for 2 seconds longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked back toward the great hall with the measured stride of a woman returning to a party, her silver dress catching the torchlight, her heartbeat running 15 beats per minute above normal, and every nerve in her body tuned to the specific frequency of danger in a way that she would never, under any circumstances, allow to show on her face. The great hall received her return without comment. The ball had reached its middle hours, the point in the evening where wine had softened inhibitions and conversations had migrated from political performance to something approaching candor. Seraphine moved through the crowd, smiling, engaging, performing the role of the Duke's bride with flawless composure while her eyes tracked every server, every shadow, every movement in the periphery of the room that deviated from the expected patterns of a formal social event. She found Margrave near the east hearth. "Dance with me," Seraphine said. The trade minister raised both eyebrows. "My lady, I do not—" "You have been watching the service corridors for the past 20 minutes. You noticed something. I need to know what it is, and I need to know it while we are moving through a crowd where lip-reading is impossible." Margrave stared at her for 1 second, then she extended her hand. They moved onto the floor. The waltz was slow, stately, the kind of dance designed for conversation between partners who needed to maintain the appearance of social grace while conducting business. Margrave led, Seraphine led her. "2 servers I did not approve through the trade delegation intake," Margrave said quietly, her mouth barely moving. "They came in with the Ashford Merchant Group 3 weeks ago. I flagged the discrepancy in my records, but Chancellor Voss overrode my concern. Where are they now? One is stationed at the North Service table. The other disappeared into the kitchen corridor approximately 10 minutes ago. Did you see which direction? East, toward the residential tower stairwell." Seraphine's blood went cold. The residential tower stairwell led to the east tower, her chambers. If the operative's target was her, and one of them was moving toward her empty chambers, then the plan was not to attack her in public. The plan was to be waiting for her when she returned. Quiet. Contained. The kind of disappearance that would not be discovered until morning, when the Duke would find his Duchess gone and every piece of evidence carefully arranged to point toward the man already sitting in the lower cells. Voss would be blamed. Caedric would implode. The kingdom would fracture. Seraphine released Margrave's hand. "Find Lord Rourke. Tell him East Tower. Now." She moved through the crowd, fast but not running. A woman walking with purpose through a ballroom was unremarkable. A woman running through a ballroom was a crisis. She reached the east corridor and turned the corner and nearly collided with Caedric. who was coming from the opposite direction with blood on his right hand and a look on his face that she had not seen before. Not rage, not calculation, something beyond both. The expression of a man who had just crossed a line inside himself and discovered that the territory on the other side was not what he expected. "3 down," he said. His breathing was controlled, but his pupils were dilated, and the tendons in his forearm were still contracted from the grip that had produced the blood on his knuckles. "Rourke has 2 more contained in the stable block. The 6th was in the kitchen. He fought. He lost. There is one moving toward the east tower. Margrave identified him 10 minutes ago." Caedric's expression shifted. The controlled operational focus sharpened into something more primal. She could see it happen in real time, the way his body reorganized itself around a single objective, every muscle redirecting, every breath deepening, the physical transformation of a man converting from commander to predator. "Stay here." "No." "Seraphine." It was the first time he had used her name, not her title, not her family name, not the formal address that protocol demanded and distance required. Her name. Spoken in a voice that contained none of the Duke's authority and all of his terror. The voice of a man who had just discovered that the word for what he felt was not possession or obsession or strategic attachment, but something far simpler and far more devastating, and who was hearing that discovery in his own voice for the first time. "I am not staying here," she said. "If he reaches my chambers and finds them empty, he will reposition. We lose track of him. He goes to ground inside a castle with 300 civilians, and we spend the rest of the night hunting a trained operative in a crowd. I need to be in those chambers when he arrives. You're asking me to let you walk into a room with a man sent to abduct or kill you. I'm asking you to be in the room next to mine when he comes through the door." Caedric's jaw worked. The muscles in his face fought a war that lasted 4 seconds and produced no clear winner. His hands were fists at his sides. The blood on his right knuckles had begun to dry, darkening from red to the color of rust. "If he touches you, I will take him apart. If he touches me, I will handle it long enough for you to come through the adjoining door. I am not a porcelain figure, Caedric. I am the woman who identified 8 infiltrators in your castle while your entire security apparatus missed them. Give me the credit of being capable of surviving 30 seconds alone with a man who does not know I am expecting him." He looked at her. The torchlight carved his face into angles of shadow and amber. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with the raw, ungovernable reality that he could not command what he felt for her any more than he could command the tide, and the inability to command it was rewriting every principle he had built his life upon. He nodded once. They moved. The East Tower stairwell was dark and cold, spiraling upward through stone that retained the winter temperature regardless of the fires burning in the rooms above. Caedric took the stairs 2 at a time, silent, his boots finding the stone with the practiced certainty of a man who had navigated this castle in darkness for 20 years. Seraphine followed 3 steps behind, her silver dress gathered in one hand, her breathing controlled, her heartbeat a steady drum against her ribs that she regulated through force of will because panic was a luxury she could not afford and would not indulge. They reached her floor. Caedric pressed his back against the wall beside the adjoining chamber door. He drew his blade. The steel caught the faint torchlight from the stairwell and threw a thin line of reflected light across the corridor ceiling. His eyes met hers one more time. Everything he could not say was in that look. Every defense he had spent 20 years constructing, every wall he had built between himself and the possibility of caring about another person's survival as much as his own. All of it visible for 3 seconds in the gray eyes of a man who had just discovered that the most terrifying thing in the world was not betrayal or war or the collapse of an empire. It was having something to lose. Seraphine opened the door to her chambers and stepped inside. The room was dark. The fire had burned down to embers. The windows were shuttered against the winter storm that had been building all evening, and the only light came from the faint orange glow of dying coals and the thin crack of torchlight from the corridor behind her. She left the door open 3 inches. Enough for sound to carry, enough for Caedric to hear. She moved to the center of the room and waited. 20 seconds. She counted them. Her pulse was a metronome she used to track the time because counting seconds with her heartbeat gave her mind a task that was not fear. 30 seconds. The wind outside hammered the shutters. The embers shifted in the hearth with a soft crack that sounded, in the silence, like a bone breaking. 40 seconds. A sound that was not wind, not embers, not the settling of old stone in cold air. A sound from behind the heavy curtain that separated her sleeping chamber from the dressing alcove. The sound of fabric moving against a body that was trying very hard not to move at all. He was already inside. He had not come up the stairwell. He had come through the service passage that connected the dressing alcove to the servants' corridor, the passage she had identified on her second day in the castle and had noted in the same mental inventory that held every other structural detail of Blackthorne Keep. The curtain moved. The man came through fast. Not the rushed, panicked speed of an amateur, the fluid, committed speed of someone trained to close distance before a target could react. He was average height, average build, wearing the servant's livery that Margrave had described, and he carried a short blade in his right hand and a cloth hood in his left. Abduction. Not assassination. They wanted her alive. Seraphine did not scream. She did not freeze. She threw the heavy silver candlestick from her bedside table directly at his face. The impact caught him across the bridge of the nose. Not hard enough to stop him, hard enough to make him flinch, to break his momentum for the half-second she needed. "Now," she said. The adjoining door exploded inward. Caedric came through it like something unleashed. Not the controlled, precise commander she had watched in council chambers and war rooms. Something older and more fundamental. The version of him that existed beneath every layer of civilization and strategy and calculated restraint. The version that processed threat to the people it could not lose as an extinction-level event requiring an extinction-level response. He hit the operative before the man could turn. The impact drove both of them into the stone wall with a sound that resonated through the floor. The operative's blade clattered free. He fought. He was trained and he was desperate, and he fought with the savage efficiency of a man who understood that failure meant death. He drove an elbow into Caedric's ribs. He twisted. He reached for the fallen blade. Caedric caught his wrist and broke it. The sound was sharp, precise, final. The operative screamed. Caedric drove him to the floor with a knee against his spine and one hand locked around the back of his neck, pressing his face into the stone with enough force to end the struggle but not enough to kill him. Because Seraphine had said they needed intelligence. Because even now, even in the grip of something that had moved past fury into a territory he did not have a name for, he was listening to her. Seraphine knelt beside the pinned operative. Her hands were shaking. She locked them together to make them stop. "Who sent you? How many more? What is the extraction route?" The man said nothing. Blood from his broken nose pooled on the stone beneath his face. Caedric increased the pressure on his neck. Not enough to crush, enough to communicate that crushing was available and imminent. "She asked you a question," the Duke said. His voice was barely human. It came from the same place that had produced the look in his eyes in the corridor. Below thought, below control. From the part of a man that exists before language, before civilization, before every system built to contain the raw machinery of what it means to care about something enough to destroy everything else in its defense. The operative talked. He talked for 9 minutes. He gave them the extraction route through the northern postern gate. He gave them the handler's location in a rented room above the chandler's shop in the outer ward. He gave them the schedule for the secondary team positioned in the village below the castle, waiting to receive the Duchess and transport her south. And he gave them the final piece, the one that changed everything. Haldane was not in the south. Haldane was 3 miles from Blackthorne Keep, camped in the tree line on the western ridge with 400 mounted soldiers, waiting for the signal that the Duchess had been taken and the Duke's response had begun. The moment Caedric turned his forces inward, the moment the castle descended into the chaos of internal purge and recrimination, Haldane would ride. Not for the castle. For the undefended supply depot at Crewe, 20 miles east, where the entire Northern Territory's winter provisions and military equipment were stored. Take Crewe and Blackthorne starves. The castle becomes a tomb. 400 men take what 12,000 could not because the Duke is too busy destroying his own people to notice the real attack. Seraphine looked at Caedric across the body of the man pinned between them. His face was streaked with sweat and blood, and the expression on it was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The expression of a man who had just heard the complete architecture of his own destruction laid out in precise, mechanical detail, and who understood, with absolute clarity, that surviving it would require becoming something he had never been. Not harder, not colder, not more ruthless. The opposite. Trusting someone else enough to divide the weight. Rourke takes the garrison east to Crewe, Seraphine said. Forced march. He can reach it before Haldane if he leaves within the hour. You hold the castle with the household guard and close every gate. Haldane loses his supply target and his infiltration team in the same night. If Rourke takes the garrison, I hold this castle with 60 men against a possible assault. Haldane will not assault the castle. The castle was never his objective. Crewe was his objective. Without the supply depot, his 400 men become 400 mouths with no provisions and no strategic value. He retreats or he dies in the snow. Caedric stared at her. His hand was still locked on the operative's neck. His knuckles were white. The muscles in his forearm trembled with sustained force, and something else, something that ran deeper than adrenaline, deeper than combat physiology, all the way down to the foundation of a man who was watching his entire operational philosophy collapse and replace itself in real time. He was learning to trust her, not as a theory, not as a strategic calculation, as a lived act performed under fire, with everything at stake and no guarantee that the outcome would be survivable. Send Rourke, he said. It was the hardest sentence he had ever spoken. 2 words that dismantled 20 years of absolute solitary control and rebuilt them into something terrifying and new. Something that included another person inside the architecture of survival. Something that meant his life and his kingdom and everything he had built now depended on the judgment of a woman he had known for 2 months who was kneeling on a stone floor with blood on her silver dress and the steadiest eyes he had ever seen. Rourke was dispatched, the garrison mobilized, the castle gates sealed, and somewhere on the western ridge, Lord Haldane sat on his warhorse in the frozen darkness, watching the torches of Blackthorne Keep flicker in the storm wind, waiting for the signal that never came, and not yet understanding that the trap he had built so carefully had just closed around him instead. But Haldane was not a man who accepted failure gracefully. And as the first gray light of dawn cracked the eastern horizon and the garrison's torches disappeared down the road toward Crewe, a rider broke from the tree line on the western ridge and galloped toward the castle with a white flag snapping in the wind. Not a surrender, a challenge. Haldane was coming to Blackthorne Keep himself. And the message the rider carried, delivered to the sealed gate and passed hand over hand to the Duke, standing in the frozen courtyard with 60 men and a woman in a blood-stained silver dress, contained 4 words that turned the entire war from a chess match into a knife fight. Give me the Duchess. Caedric read the message once. He folded the parchment along its original crease with the mechanical precision of a man performing a small task to prevent himself from performing a catastrophic one. He handed the parchment to the nearest guard without looking at him. Then he stood very still in the frozen courtyard of Blackthorne Keep, with the winter dawn bleeding gray light across the flagstones, and 60 men watching him from the walls and the gates and the towers, and he breathed. 4 words. Give me the Duchess. The old Caedric would have answered in steel before the rider's horse cleared the gatehouse. The old Caedric would have mounted every available man and charged the western ridge with the blind, incandescent fury that had governed every crisis of his adult life. The old Caedric would have treated the demand as a personal insult requiring a personal, violent, immediate response, because the old Caedric understood the world through a single lens, and that lens converted every threat into a problem solvable by force. The old Caedric was dead. He had died sometime in the past 12 hours. In a council chamber where his chancellor's betrayal shattered the architecture of control he had spent 20 years perfecting, and in a dark bedroom where a woman threw a candlestick at an assassin's face and then knelt on a stone floor with blood on her silver dress, and told him how to save his kingdom with a voice steadier than his own. The man standing in the courtyard now did not yet know what he was. He knew only what he was not. He was not the machine. He was not the fortress. He was not the system of absolute solitary control that had kept him alive and kept him numb in equal measure since the night a 14-year-old boy decided that grief was a vulnerability and converted it into fuel. He was something unfinished, something mid-construction, and the foundation of whatever he was becoming stood 6 feet behind him in a blood-stained dress, watching him with dark eyes that held no pity and no fear, and no illusion about the difficulty of what came next. "How many at the tree line?" Caedric said. The guard who had taken the message spoke. "Scouts estimate 350 to 400 mounted. Heavy cavalry, battle formation along the ridge. He cannot hold that position longer than a day. His supply line is non-existent and Rourke will take crew before noon. Haldane is gambling that I respond before I think." "Your Grace, if he advances on the castle with 400, he will not advance. Advancing on a fortified position with no siege equipment and no supply chain is a death sentence, and Haldane knows it. The message is not a military action. It is a provocation. He wants me outside these walls." Seraphine stepped forward. The guards parted for her without being told, an instinctive response to something they could not articulate but could feel. The recognition that the woman in the silver dress occupied a position in the Duke's operational structure that did not have a title or a precedent, but was no less real for the absence of either. "He wants you outside these walls because inside them you are untouchable," she said. "His infiltration team is neutralized. His supply target is about to be secured. Every component of his strategy has failed except one: you. Your pride. Your instinct to answer a challenge with personal force. That is the last weapon he has left, and he is aiming it at the one vulnerability he still believes is exploitable. My pride, your pattern. 20 years of responding to every provocation with direct, personal, overwhelming violence. He has studied you the way I studied your treasury records. He knows the architecture. He is counting on you behaving like the system he mapped." Caedric turned to face her. The courtyard was quiet except for the wind and the stamping of horses in the stable block and the distant, almost subliminal sound of 400 enemy soldiers breathing on the ridge above them. His gray eyes found hers and held them with an intensity that had nothing to do with command. "What do you recommend?" 2 months ago, the question would have been impossible. 2 months ago, Caedric Ashbourne did not ask for recommendations. He issued orders. He processed intelligence. He made decisions in the solitary chamber of his own mind and executed them with the certainty of a man who believed that consulting another person was an admission of inadequacy. But adequacy was a standard built for a world that no longer existed. The world he operated in now was the world Seraphine had shown him. A world where strength was not the absence of dependence, but the capacity to depend on the right person at the right moment for the right reason. And the learning of that lesson had cost him everything he thought he was and given him something he did not yet know how to name. "Respond to the message," Seraphine said, "not with steel, with an invitation." An invitation. Invite Haldane into Blackthorne Keep, under a banner of parley, full diplomatic protocol, witnessed by every noble house still present from the ball. The courtyard went silent in a way that transcended the absence of sound. It was the silence of 60 men simultaneously processing information that contradicted everything they understood about the man they served. "You want me to open my gates to the man who sent assassins to abduct my wife. I want you to put him in a room with 300 witnesses and no army. I want you to strip away every structural advantage he holds and force him to operate as what he actually is. A man. Not a general, not a strategist. A man standing in front of the Duke he tried to destroy, answering for what he did, in a context where violence is impossible and the only weapon available is the truth. And if the truth is not enough, the truth is never enough by itself, but the truth combined with the fact that his army has no supplies, his infiltration team is in your cells, his chancellor asset is neutralized, and his entire strategic position collapsed overnight, creates a context where the truth does not need to be enough. It just needs to be public. Caedric stood in the gray dawn light and felt something shift inside his chest. Not a thought, something structural, something that had been locked in place for 20 years and was now, under the accumulated pressure of everything that had happened in the past 12 hours, finally releasing. The shift was not comfortable. It felt like a bone resetting after a long dislocation, the grinding, necessary pain of something returning to the position it was supposed to occupy. He was learning that the most terrifying thing a man could do was not kill an enemy or hold a castle or crush a rebellion. The most terrifying thing was to stand still when every instinct screamed for violence and choose a different path. Not because the different path was softer, because it was harder. Because it required tolerating the uncertainty that came from trusting another person's judgment as much as his own. Because it meant admitting that the version of himself he had been performing for 2 decades was not strength. It was armor. And armor, worn long enough, became indistinguishable from a cage. "Send the rider back," Caedric said. "Tell Haldane the gates of Blackthorne Keep are open. Full parley. Witness proceedings. He comes alone or with a maximum escort of 10, and tell him that the Duke of Blackthorne guarantees his safety for the duration of the proceedings." The guard hesitated. "Your Grace, guaranteeing the safety of a man who—" "I know what he did. Send the message." The rider departed. The gate opened and closed. The sound of hooves on frozen ground faded into the gray distance. Seraphine stood beside him, not touching, not speaking, present. The warmth of her proximity was a physical fact that his body registered independently of his mind, the way a frozen man registers the first heat source without deciding to move toward it. "You are gambling that he accepts," Caedric said. "He will accept, because refusing a public parley after sending a demand makes him look weak, and looking weak is the one thing Haldane cannot afford when his strategic position is collapsing. His only remaining play is to walk into this room and attempt to negotiate from a position he no longer holds. And negotiation is a battlefield where you have never fought before, which means he still believes he has the advantage. He does have the advantage in negotiation. He had the advantage before I arrived. Now you have something he does not have and cannot replicate, which is someone who tells you the truth." Haldane arrived at midday. He came through the main gate with an escort of 8 mounted guards, all of whom were disarmed at the gatehouse and escorted to a holding area in the outer ward. Haldane himself entered the great hall on foot, wearing a dress uniform that suggested he had packed for exactly this contingency, which told Seraphine everything she needed to know about the man's psychology. He had planned for failure. Not because he expected to fail, but because he was the kind of strategist who packed a diplomatic costume alongside his battle armor. He was intelligent. That made him more dangerous than a purely military opponent, but it also made him more predictable, because intelligent men believed in their own intelligence, the way other men believed in their swords, and that belief created blind spots large enough to drive a strategy through. The great hall had been arranged for the parley in the 2 hours since the invitation was sent. The banquet tables were cleared. A single long table occupied the center of the room, positioned beneath the full light of the overhead chandeliers with no shadows, no alcoves, no architectural features that would allow private conversation or concealed movement. Chairs lined the walls for the noble witnesses, 47 lords and ladies who had remained at Blackthorne after the ball, and who now sat in various states of shock, fascination, and political calculation as they watched the 2 most powerful men in the kingdom prepare to face each other across 12 feet of black oak. Caedric sat at the north end of the table. He wore black. His face was unreadable. His hands rested on the table surface in full view, a deliberate choice that communicated both transparency and the quiet confidence of a man who did not need to conceal anything. Seraphine sat at his right, not behind him, not removed from the proceedings in the decorative position that protocol would have assigned the Duke's bride. Beside him, at the table, in the negotiation. The positioning was a statement that every noble in the room registered, and that Haldane, walking toward the south end of the table with the measured stride of a man entering hostile territory, absorbed with a flicker of recalculation behind his eyes. He had expected to face the Duke alone. He had not expected to face the woman his entire operation had been designed to remove. "Your Grace," Haldane said. He sat. He was 53, silver-haired, with the lean, preserved look of a man who maintained his body as carefully as he maintained his political positions. His eyes were blue and sharp, and held the particular intelligence of someone who had been underestimating opponents and getting away with it for 30 years. "I appreciate the courtesy of the parley." "You are not here because of courtesy," Caedric said. "You are here because your army has no supply line. Your operatives are in my cells, and your strategic position collapsed 12 hours ago. Courtesy has nothing to do with it." Haldane's expression did not change, but something tightened in the skin around his eyes. A micro-contraction. The kind of involuntary response that occurs when reality arrives faster than a man's narrative can accommodate it. "I have 400 mounted soldiers on your western ridge. You have 400 men with 3 days of provisions and no access to the crew supply depot, which Lord Rourke's garrison secured this morning. In 72 hours, your cavalry will be eating their horses. In a week, they will be walking south in the snow." "You did not bring an army, Lord Haldane. You brought a negotiating prop, and the prop has an expiration date." The noble witnesses were silent. 47 people held their breath simultaneously. Haldane leaned back in his chair. The movement was controlled, deliberate. The physical language of a man projecting comfort in a situation where comfort did not exist. "And what are the Duke's terms?" Caedric looked at Seraphine. It was a small movement, a turn of the head that lasted less than 2 seconds. But every person in the room saw it, and every person in the room understood what it meant. The Duke of Blackthorne, the man who had governed the Northern Territories through absolute solitary authority for 20 years, had just deferred to another person in front of the entire aristocracy. The political implications were seismic. Seraphine spoke. "House Haldane surrenders all territorial claims east of the Ashford Corridor. The Southern Alliance disbands, and each constituent house reaffirms its treaty obligations to the Crown individually, not as a bloc. Lord Haldane personally signs a confession detailing his sponsorship of the infiltration operation, the assassination attempt on the Duchess of Blackthorne, and the 9-year intelligence relationship with Chancellor Voss. The confession is witnessed by every noble present, and copies are distributed to the royal court." Haldane's composure fractured, not dramatically. The crack was visible only in the whitening of his knuckles on the table edge and the single, involuntary swallow that betrayed the dryness of his throat. "You are asking me to destroy my own house. I am offering you the survival of your house. The alternative is that the Duke prosecutes the assassination attempt as an act of war, mobilizes the Northern Coalition, and reduces every Haldane holding to rubble within the season. You lose the territory either way. This way you keep your bloodline. And what guarantee do I have that the Duke will honor these terms once I have signed?" Seraphine did not look at Caedric. She did not need to. "You have my word." Haldane stared at her. Then he looked at Caedric. The Duke's gray eyes were fixed on Haldane with an expression that contained no threat, no fury, and no negotiation. It contained certainty. The absolute, immovable certainty of a man who had found the one person he would rebuild his entire world around, and who understood that the rebuilding had already begun. "Her word is my word," Caedric said, "and my word is the only currency that has ever held value in this kingdom. You know this." The silence lasted 11 seconds. Seraphine counted. Haldane signed. What? The Southern Lords departed Blackthorne Keep over the following 3 days, a procession of surrendered ambition that wound through the northern passes like a funeral march without a corpse. Haldane's cavalry withdrew from the western ridge on the second morning, their horses thin and their riders silent with the particular humiliation of men who had been positioned for war and delivered to peace by a woman in a silver dress who never raised her voice above conversational volume. The confession was copied 14 times and distributed by royal courier to every major court in Westmere. The document was dry, factual, devastating. It described, in Haldane's own hand, the systematic corruption of a duke's chancellor, the placement of operatives inside a sovereign fortress, and the planned abduction of a noblewoman for the purpose of political destabilization. It did not mention love. It did not mention obsession. It did not mention the personal transformation of the man it was designed to destroy. Those details were not relevant to the political record, but they were relevant to the two people who lived them. No. Voss was tried in the Great Hall 4 days after the parley. The proceeding lasted 2 hours. The evidence was comprehensive. The verdict was unanimous. The sentence was exile to the northern wastes beyond the kingdom's border, a punishment worse than execution in the eyes of a man who had spent his entire life at the center of power. Caedric delivered the sentence himself. Voss stood in the great hall in chains, his gray hair disheveled for the first time in 3 decades, his immaculate composure finally irreversibly broken. He looked at the Duke he had served and betrayed with the exhausted clarity of a man who had nothing left to perform. "You will not survive without a chancellor," Voss said. "I will not survive with a chancellor I cannot trust. The distinction matters." "And who will you trust? Her? That is not your concern anymore." Voss nodded slowly. He looked at Seraphine standing at the Duke's right. He did not smile. He did not apologize. He looked at her with the particular recognition of a man who understood too late that the thing he had feared most about her arrival was the thing the Duke had needed most: someone who could not be controlled. The guards escorted him out. The great hall doors closed behind him. The sound echoed through the stone for 3 seconds, and then there was silence, and the silence was not empty. It was full of the specific gravity that exists in a room where a 31-year relationship has just ended, and the people remaining in it must now construct something in the space where it used to be. The weeks after the crisis moved slowly, the way all periods of reconstruction move slowly. Not because nothing happened, but because everything that happened required a patience that neither Caedric nor the kingdom he governed had much practice with. The eastern mines were reformed. Seraphine oversaw the restructuring personally, traveling to the labor settlements with an escort of Rourke soldiers and a team of auditors she had recruited from the Ashford Merchant Guild. What she found in the mines was worse than the record suggested. Families working in conditions that reduced human beings to components in an extraction process. Children carrying ore in tunnels too small for adults. A system so thoroughly dehumanized that the people operating it had stopped seeing the workers as people and had started seeing them as a cost line in a production spreadsheet. She dismantled the system in 6 weeks. Not through outrage. Outrage burned hot and faded fast. Through logistics. She restructured the labor contracts, established mandatory rest rotations, redirected Ashbourne treasury funds to build housing that had walls and floors, and the basic architectural dignity of spaces designed for human habitation rather than storage. She did it the way she did everything, with precision, with data, with the relentless systematic energy of a woman who understood that the world did not change through passion. It changed through the accumulated pressure of correct decisions applied consistently over time. Caedric watched her work. He did not understand all of it. The economics of labor reform were not his area of expertise, and expertise was something he was learning to recognize in other people, rather than demanding it of himself alone. But he understood the effect. The villages along the eastern ridge, the same villages that had been emptied and relocated and ground into the machinery of his financial empire, began to recover. Slowly, painfully, with the cautious, tentative movements of organisms that had been crushed and were not yet sure whether the crushing had stopped. He stood on the walls of Blackthorne Keep one evening in early spring, watching the sunset turn the valley below from white to gold, and felt something he had no name for. Not pride. Pride was a performance for an audience. This was internal, private, a sensation that existed entirely between himself and the landscape, and the knowledge that the landscape was marginally less brutal today because of decisions he had allowed someone else to influence. That was the word. Allowed. Not commanded. Not coerced. Not engineered through leverage or threat. Allowed. Permitted. The voluntary surrender of absolute control to a partnership that operated on trust rather than hierarchy. It was the most disorienting experience of his life. And it was, in ways he was only beginning to understand, the only experience that had ever felt real. Seraphine found him on the wall as the last light faded. She stood beside him without speaking. She did that often now. Occupied the space beside him without filling it with words or demands or expectations. Simply present. The physical fact of another person choosing to be near him, not because proximity was required, but because proximity was wanted. The crew iron contracts are restructured, she said eventually. Margrave negotiated a 12% reduction in processing costs. The savings cover the mine reform budget for the next 2 years. You came up here to tell me about iron contracts. I came up here because you have been standing on this wall for 40 minutes, and the temperature is dropping and you are not wearing a coat. He looked at her. The spring wind moved through her dark hair. Her face in the fading light held the same angular sharpness that had struck him the first time he saw her. The same quality of attention that had made him uncomfortable and fascinated and ultimately defenseless. But something was different now. Not in her face. in the way he saw it. The evaluative distance was gone. The analytical filter through which he had processed every human being for 20 years had dissolved, replaced by something simpler and more terrifying. He saw her, not as a variable, not as an instrument, not as a strategic element in the architecture of his power, as a person, as the specific, irreplaceable, entirely autonomous person who had walked into his fortress and taken it apart and rebuilt it around both of them, and who was now standing on his wall in the wind telling him to put on a coat. "I do not know how to be the man you need," he said. "I do not need a man. I need a partner. The distinction matters." "You keep saying that, the distinction matters, because you keep needing to hear it." He was quiet for a long time. The valley below them darkened. The first stars appeared, cold and sharp against the deepening blue. "I spent 20 years building a system designed to make me untouchable. Every decision, every execution, every alliance crushed and rebuilt on terms that guaranteed I would never depend on another person for anything. I built it because a 14-year-old boy watched his father die and decided that the only safe position in the world was the one where no one could reach him." He paused. His jaw worked. The words were coming from a place he had sealed shut 2 decades ago, and the unsealing was not elegant or controlled. It was rough and halting and real. "And you walked through the gate in a silver dress and reached me in 3 days." Seraphine looked at him. Her dark eyes held his gray ones in the growing darkness, and what passed between them was not a declaration and not a promise, and not any of the performed rituals of romance that the aristocracy used to formalize what existed between men and women. It was recognition. The mutual, devastating, irreversible recognition of 2 people who had spent their lives building defenses against exactly this, and who understood, standing on a cold wall in the wind, that the defenses had failed, and that the failure was the only honest thing either of them had ever experienced. "I did not come here to save you," she said. "I came here to survive a bad situation. Everything that happened after that was not rescue. It was 2 people solving the same problem from different angles and discovering that the solution worked better together than apart." That is a very analytical way to describe what this is. Would you prefer something less analytical? I would prefer the truth. The truth is that I stood on a cliff above my family's harbor the night before I left and told my brother that I would survive by finding the levers that changed the equation. And I found the levers. I found all of them. And the one I did not expect to find was that the most powerful lever in the entire system was not financial or military or political. It was you, choosing to let me in. That is the only thing that actually changed anything, not my analysis, not my strategy, your choice. Caedric reached for her hand. The gesture was not smooth. It was not practiced. It had the awkward, deliberate quality of a man performing an action he had never performed before, his fingers finding hers in the dark with the uncertain precision of someone navigating without a map. His hand was calloused from swords and rough from cold, and it closed around hers with a grip that was too tight and not tight enough, and that communicated, through the imperfection of its pressure, everything that words were still too small to carry. Seraphine held on. They stood on the wall of Blackthorne Keep as the night settled over Westmere and the stars burned above them with the ancient, indifferent light of objects that had watched empires rise and collapse for millennia and would continue watching long after every castle and every duke and every woman in a silver dress had returned to the earth. Below them, the kingdom was healing. Slowly, imperfectly, with the grinding, necessary patience of a structure being rebuilt by people who were themselves being rebuilt. And inside the black towers of the castle that had once been a monument to one man's fear of vulnerability, something new was taking root. Not soft, not gentle. Not the kind of transformation that stories like to dress in sunlight and redemption. Something harder and more honest. The recognition that survival, real survival, the kind that did not hollow a person out from the inside, was not a solitary act. It was the most dangerous form of partnership, the kind where 2 people agreed to carry the weight together and trusted each other enough to believe that neither one would let go. Caedric Ashbourne had governed Westmere for 20 years through fear and force and the systematic elimination of every human connection that might have weakened his grip on power. Seraphine Valmont had arrived at his gate with a locked trunk, and a mind that saw the world as an engineering problem, and the unshakable conviction that every system, no matter how fortified, had joints where the right pressure could redistribute the entire weight. She had been right. The joint was him, and the pressure she applied was the simplest, most devastating force in the architecture of human survival. She stayed,